So as promised, I made a few adjustments to our package, and I want to go through each of those adjustments and show you what I made and why I made those changes. So starting with the server command that we have, if we take a look at this, this is what it looks like right now. So now we have inside of our handle method, we are now, instead of having all the code in line inside of our command, I now moved all of this into a class. It's a server class, and this server class now receives the shell as a dependency, and it receives an output interface, and in addition it also receives the host. So this allows us to reuse this server class in other parts of applications as well. So for example, this package right now has this Laravel command, but if you want to use this package, for example, with a Symfony application, you can do this as well, and then you can just reuse this server class and pass it just the settings and the objects that it needs, and then start the server. So what I still have inside of this command is the create warning formatter, so that we have this warning styles in our output. And I am creating the PsyShell object because this still contains the Laravel specific code for the class alias loader. And also the casters, which also belongs to Laravel. So I think it just makes more sense to have this in the command as well. Now, if we take a look at the server, one of the reasons I created this class was to have this easier testable. So now this server class receives the host, it receives the PsyShell, it receives some output. It can receive a loop interface for the event loop, and if no loop interface is specified, then it will just create one. So for example, in the server command, we do not pass these objects, so it will just create them for us. And the same for the standard in, standard out. We could pass this onto our server object, but if we don't, then we just create the standard in, standard out ourselves. So this is what the constructor looks like. And in our case, the create stdio would look like this. So this is basically the code that we had in our command class before, and then I just moved it inside of its own method in here. Then when you actually start the server, we set the output to the shell that we have. So this is just the buffered output that we have. Then I have this create socket server method, which also is basically just taken from the command. We had it inline in there. We just received we create a new socket server for the host and the event loop, and then we have our event listeners for new incoming data. And one thing that I stripped away in the previous code that we had inside of the command, the execution of the code was duplicated. So inside of this event listener, we had the code execution, and we also had it inside of the standard in, standard out. So instead of having this duplicate code, I just moved this into a method that we have in here, and there we just create this execution closure with the shell and the code that we pass in here and then execute it. So this is basically just the way I refactored it, and what this allowed me is that I was able to create tests for this. So this is what the test looks like. To be honest, the testing part was the most experimental because I have not yet used React PHP and haven't really created tests for it. The way that I do it right now is more of an integration test. So let's take a look at the tests. So one test is that it detects if the Tinker server is offline. So this is quite simple. We have this connection object that we also had before. And then I'm just writing something to this connection. And then I assert that the result of this write method is going to be false because the server is not started in this context, and, well, the right method should return false in this case. Then for the testing of that it actually dumps some information, I had kind of a different approach. So I'm starting a new connection, and inside of the test class I have defined some host configuration. So we create a connection, then we create a server process. So this is what it looks like. I'm using the Symfony PHP process. So I'm starting a PHP process for this specific file's content. I'll look into this later. And we pass some environment information to this script, which is the component root. So this is basically the directory where we have our vendor files. And the host for our server, which is the one inside of this test class. And then we set a timeout of this process of 3 seconds. So what this server looks like is this. So we have the component root, and then we load the vendor files from there. Then we create a new loop factory that we pass manually into the server. I create the buffered output. I create the psi shell. So this is the config, and then this is the shell. And I create the standard in, standard out. Then pass all of this to our server. Then I just echo ready with a new line character and then start the server. So the test now looks like this. We receive the server process. Then I start the process and pass it a callback, and this callback gets called every time the output buffer of this process writes some kind of information. Okay, so we have this, and then if the process type, the output type for the start command is an error, then we just stop the process and mark the test as failed. So this is when something just goes wrong. Then we have the case that the buffer is ready \n. So this is basically this. So this means that we could start this file up to this point, and then the server would get started. So when in our test we receive this string, then we wait for half a second. This is to actually start the server. And then after the half second, we are going to write this array to our connection. So this would be something similar to calling tinker I, and I would be 10. So this is what it will look like. So, and then we make the assertion that the right result is true, because we have started the server in this case, and then this should be successful. And everything else that we have as output should be added to this variable called dumped. So this means that we write this data to our connection, and then we just basically wait for the specified timeout, so for 3 seconds in this case. And after the timeout was reached, so we catch this as it will time out, but we don't, it doesn't matter. And after the timeout, we are asserting that the dumped information looks something like this. So there's a lot of console output in here. I wasn't able to actually dump this without all this console ASCII characters, but at the end, this is the result. So then after the server was called and we use this and write this to the connection, we are asserting that the output contains the 2 characters with $I, because that's what we are dumping. And then followed by the evaluation from our shell, which is the integer 10. And yeah, those tests are passing. It's running on Travis CI, and if I just run this locally, like this, it works. So the only downside is that we have to wait like 3 seconds, because that's the timeout that we specified and the process is timing out. But with this, we basically have an integration test of starting our Tinker server and then sending information to the server with our connection class. Okay, so this is basically the finished package, as I also tagged this with the 1.0 version. I didn't do anything else that you have not seen. The only thing that I did, was basically just creating the README, which contains the information about the package, and that's it. So you can use this package now, it's on GitHub, and you can use this to tinker variables with your Laravel application.